Hi, I'm Judith Panero, the Executive Director for AAMC and AAMC Foundation, the leading organization for all art curators serving many, not few. It is a pleasure to welcome you to today's virtual discussion. Thank you for joining us. We hope that you, our community of colleagues, allies, and supporters around the globe are healthy and safe. In 2019, we held over 50 programs bringing together more than 1,300 individuals from 19 countries, providing an exchange of information on critical topics for the nonprofit arts community. Since early March of this year, our work has continued to address ongoing issues in the visual arts organizations, as well as concerns rising from the current pandemic. We've greatly enhanced an already robust online programming calendar by presenting varied offerings, such as the one we are gathered together for today. With your participation and feedback, we continue to ensure we are addressing the needs of our audience and moving the field forwards towards an equitable, inclusive, and sustainable future. For many years, we have been presenting webinars, virtual programming, which are accessible on our website through archived recordings. You can also find information on upcoming ones on our website as well at artcurators.org. We hope that they provide actionable advice, value, and connectivity. We welcome all nonprofit art curators to join our organization. Benefits of membership include networking with our global audience, access to discounted and free in-person and virtual programs and fellowships, and importantly, the opportunity to be part of a unified voice for and of curators. Additionally, our foundation serves the larger curatorial and arts community, and should you wish, donations are welcome from you as an individual, a corporation, and/or foundation. Any amount will have direct impact on our work. You can see options for donating on our site. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy the program.
Good afternoon and welcome to the second webinar in AAMC's Foundation Provenance 2 webinar series. Thank you all for making the time to join us today. My name is Allison Gilchrist. I serve as the Director of Applied Research and Outreach at Yale University's Institute for the Preservation of Cultural Heritage. Prior to joining Yale, a mere 6 weeks before the campus shut down for a global pandemic, I was the Program Officer for Art History, Conservation, and Museums at the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation in New York City. While there, I was deeply engaged in exploring what role a major arts and humanities philanthropy could and should play in fostering debate, scholarship, and potential action concerning provenance questions in American museum collections, with a concerted focus on Native, Indigenous, and African material. I am moderating today's panel from my home just outside New Haven, Connecticut. Yale University acknowledges that Indigenous peoples and nations, including Mohegan, Mansatucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Schaghticoke, Golden Hill Paugasset, Niantic, and the Quinnipiac and other Algonquin-speaking peoples, have stewarded through generations the lands and waterways of what is now the state of Connecticut. We honor and respect the enduring relationship that exists between these peoples and nations and this land. May my continued work and that of my colleagues who seek to advance knowledge and truth about the stolen, dishonored, and disrupted tangible and intangible heritage of these peoples work to respect and heal these relationships. Our speakers today follow gratefully in the shoes of our colleague David Saunders, who last week moderated the first segment of this three-part series, focusing on methodological approaches to demystifying provenance research in the day-to-day. The 2020 webinars reflect the issues and questions raised in last year's series and will attempt to advance the conversation from objects to multidisciplinary processes and structures that support provenance research. Let me now introduce the panelists who are with us today so you can see who these smiling faces are. Larissa Forster, Head of Department for Cultural Goods from Colonial Contexts, the German Lost Art Foundation. Erica P. Jones, Associate Curator of African Arts at the Fowler Museum at UCLA, and Lindley McApleen. Sorry, Lindley, I think I should have. Andrew W. Mellon, Postdoctoral Curatorial Fellow at the San Antonio Museum of Art. Their extensive biographies are listed on the session website at artcurators.org. A few more notes before we dive in. Today, our session will focus on the human, financial, and rhetorical resources required to describe and advocate for the necessity of provenance research as both a standalone endeavor, as well as a practice that is more comprehensively integrated into museum, curatorial, and stewardship practices. Each of us was selected because we can speak from the perspective of doing the funding or carrying out funded research. We are prepared to give careful attention to our circumstances before this was the case, and how we arrived in situations where this support became possible. Today's session will also take a different format from the previous webinar. We're going to use a round-robin discussion rather than prepared presentations. Each speaker will give approximately 5 minutes of introductory remarks, after which we'll enter into conversation for approximately 40 minutes. As questions arise, please feel free to use the Q&A feature on your Zoom screen to submit them, and we'll either weave them into the conversation or hold them for approximately 20 minutes of open dialogue toward the end of our session. We have also assembled a list of web links and external resources that AAMC will make available after the session along with the recording. One final word. This session was made possible through the incredible ongoing support of our hardworking AAMC colleagues. I wish to warmly thank my dear colleague Judith Pinero, AAMC Executive Director, and the marvelous Program Manager, Monica Valenzuela, who has kept us all on track during this very difficult spring. Thanks also to Glorimar Garcia for all her hard work behind the scenes. It is a pleasure to make all of your care and labor more visible to this assembled group of colleagues. With that, I would like to start, and I'll ask Erica to lead off with your introduction.
Thank you, Allison. Hi. Well, as you said, I'm Erica Jones. I'm the Associate Curator of African Arts at the Fowler Museum at UCLA. As an institution, we are a little over 55 years old, and a lot of our history when it comes to provenance research has really been connected to our abundant exhibition program. And so for the majority of our history, any provenance research is linked to what we're showing in the galleries. And it's really only been in the last 2 years that we have sort of changed course, and that was because, with working with Allison when she was at the Mellon, we received a 3-year Mellon grant to do research into a subset of our African arts collection. And when the Mellon approached us with this offer to submit an application for funding, they said, what do you want to do around African arts? And we knew immediately what we really wanted to pursue, which is a subset of our African collection that came to us in 1965 from the Wellcome Trust. Sir Henry Wellcome was a pharmaceutical magnate in the UK at the turn of the previous century, and he was, it's hard not to call him a crazy collector, because when he passed away in 1936, he had acquired over 1 million objects. And after his death, a trust was formed, and the trust looked at what they had in their collection, and they said, we can't take care of this. And so they started dispersing these objects to museums around the world. I mean, there are Wellcome objects that were previously owned by Sir Henry Wellcome on nearly every continent. And so in '65, we received 30,000 objects from the Wellcome Trust. And to be entirely honest, we hadn't really researched the provenance of these pieces until we received this Mellon. And so the way we've structured this is it is a 3-pronged approach to provenance, in a sense, that we have 2 Mellon Fellows, one in curatorial and one in conservation. And so between the 2 of them and myself, we are looking at, we're just trying to say 800 objects, but let's be honest, that's pie in the sky kind of goal. We're trying to understand the histories and sort of the life stories of these objects by looking at their material histories, the actual provenance histories, as well as as well as the uses and their art historical backgrounds. And so, yeah, we're now a year into this project. We are learning all kinds of truly fascinating and truly disturbing things about this collection. And it's been a real sort of learning experience for all of us to try to work together as sort of this multivocal way of looking at objects and provenance. So that is sort of the Fowler's current foray into the world of provenance research.
Okay, Lindley, shall we turn to you?
Thank you, Allison. I thought I'd talk a little bit about my personal and professional background and how it was that I came to conduct provenance research for several years now at the San Antonio Museum of Art. So my background is in archaeology. I have a PhD in classical art and archaeology from the University of Michigan. And before I came to San Antonio, very little of my research had anything to do with provenance, other than a little work on the collections of the Kelsey Museum of Archaeology, but it wasn't my specialty. I joined the San Antonio Museum of Art in the fall of 2017 after they were awarded a fellowship for provenance research from the AAMD, the Association of Art Museum Directors, and the Crest Foundation. And I was hired to conduct provenance research on the ancient Mediterranean art collection, a collection that numbers in the thousands of objects. It was a one-year fellowship, and the way it was structured at that time was that there were 3 months to be spent here in San Antonio looking at the collections and looking at internal documents. And then there were 9 months in Los Angeles at the Getty, where I was able to take advantage of their excellent library and archives, and also to learn a lot from the experienced provenance research team at the Getty Villa. I think the fellowship is structured a little differently now, but I think that I'm still the only fellow so far who has worked on antiquities provenance as part of this program. And so in that year, I focused mainly on the Greek and Roman materials in the collection, most of which were collected between the 1960s and the 1990s by a private collector who gifted them or bequeathed them to the museum. So after the first year, I had made progress, but it became abundantly clear that a year wasn't long enough for a project like this. And so the museum was able to put together some funding of their own to hire me for a second year. And for that second year, I also added some other parts of the collection to my project, including the large Egyptian collection. And now I'm in the first year of a 2-year Mellon Fellowship, still at SAMA. And the museum was able to discuss the situation with the Mellon Foundation so that I can continue to conduct provenance research alongside carrying out other curatorial duties as part of my fellowship. And for this 2-year phase of the research, I've also added the European art collection. So the overall scope of the project encompasses both antiquities and Nazi-era provenance research. So you can see that a lot of different components and resources have come together in order for me to continue this work for 3 years now. It will eventually be 4 years at a museum the size of SAMA.
So I'll
Larissa,
continue.
please go ahead.
My name is Larissa Faster, and I think I represent the other side here, the funding side. I'm part of a foundation called German Lost Art Foundation, and that foundation was established approximately 5 years ago in order to fund Nazi-era provenance research. That was in the aftermath of the so-called Schwabing or Munich art find. And since then, interestingly, the German Lost Art Foundation has taken on other tasks as well. So in the meantime, it also funds provenance research related to dispossession in the Soviet-occupied zone in Eastern Germany, and then in Eastern Germany during the GDR times. And in early 2019, a new department was established, and that's the department that I had. It's called Cultural Goods and Collections from Colonial Contexts. And we fund provenance research, post-colonial provenance research, related to all kinds of objects that German institutions hold that were acquired in colonial times, either in early times of European colonial expansion, or during, let's say, the heydays of imperialism, and in some cases even in the aftermath of decolonization. And I guess that this funding line, I would say, is probably the first funding line that particularly tackles post-colonial provenance research and colonial loots. As far as I know, in Germany, maybe also in Europe. And what we do is we get applications from German institutions that choose from their collections convolutes that they want to do provenance research on. Some of them team up with scholars, researchers, interest groups, and institutions in the countries that the collections are from. In many cases, African countries, countries in the Pacific, where Germany, the German Reich, used to have its colonies. But we also fund, I would say, smaller projects where, for example, institutions need funds for one or two objects for very urgent provenance research in case there has been a demand for return. We look at ethnographic objects, we look at human remains that are kept in anthropological collections. We've had applications from archaeological museums, from natural history museums, and I think that's also very important. We take applications and submissions not only from the big flagship museums, from the more national level museums, from the real research institutions. Not only that, but we also encourage smaller museums to apply for funds for provenance research, because one of our aims is to foster provenance research in the whole of Germany, because Germany has a very diversified and varied landscape of museums. The German Museums Association counts a couple of thousands of museums, even in small villages, and we encourage all of them to apply for funding at our institution in order to really broadly cover German collections. And my own background, to say something on myself, is in social anthropology. I've done my PhD on the memory of colonialism in Germany and in Namibia. I've done ethnographic fieldwork on the return of human remains to Namibia, as well as to Australia. So the human remains debate for me is very important. And for you to be able to contextualize our foundation a bit, we get our money from what I would call a kind of quasi-ministry of culture in Germany, the Bundesbeauftragte für Kultur and Medien, and we get an annual budget from which then we can fund those projects that have applied at our institution.
Thank you so much for all of your opening statements and to set the context for this broader discussion. I'm seeing there's already some questions coming in, some of which echo themes that we were already prepared to speak about. So if you'll bear with us, we'll try to weave together some of those themes in our conversation, but if we don't get to you directly, we'll definitely revisit it toward the end of the session. So the question of making the case, I think, is sort of fundamental on both the funding side and the practitioner side. How do we bring financial resources to these questions? And how do we, as practitioners, be persuasive even as a funder, I'm sure in my experience of being a funder and Larissa's, you're constantly messaging up to other authorities who are asking, where is the money going, to what purpose, and can this continue to be justified over a long period of time? So making the case to highlight the value and the idea that you would dedicate money and personnel time to do this work. How do you, in your work, how do you do that? And then also, how do we argue past the very sticky question of what if we find bad things? And I think, Erica, you alluded to, you used the word disturbing in your findings. So let's talk a little bit about the fears, the anxieties, but also sort of the case making that goes into actually getting that funded line.
I could say something about the first question that you asked, Alison, and I'm very grateful for that, because I think in Germany, we're currently in a very comfortable situation because there is a political will to fund provenance research. And this is why our department has been established, and why very soon the so-called German contact point for collections from colonial contexts will be established at another kind of national foundation. So there is these framework principles in the German political sphere where the federal state and the individual states have committed themselves to funding provenance research, amongst other things. And these other things are, for example, transparency, digitizing museum collections, research in general, but also the return of cultural heritage to the countries where this heritage originated. So we are in a very comfortable situation, and thus it's taken many years to persuade politics that funding must be released and that there's really a need. And in the meantime, there is a kind of common sense, and there is a lot of activity. So I would say at the moment we're working at also encouraging institutions. Those institutions, for example, that have not yet realized that in their collections there may be colonial loots, for example. And I mean, while some of the big ethnographic museums in Germany are very well aware of that, there are smaller museums that don't have an idea because they haven't ever thought about the history of colonialism, because it's not really essentially related to the topics. So what we do is we create networks, we run mailing lists where we disseminate information. Sarah Frund and myself, we have established working groups, actually before we went into this department, where we try to create such networks to pass on information, to motivate colleagues also to get connected, to start searching for objects, start searching for archival sources and so on. So I think at the moment there's a lot of dynamics here, in particular with the Sans-Savoir report. I think that has had a great effect on the German debate. But I'd say there's a lot of the kind of lobby work that we do is speaking to a lot of museum practitioners and alerting them to the fact that there may be something in their collection that deserves more attention, and to also let's say take away the fear from them, that it's too difficult a task, and convince them that's an interesting task and that it can be achieved, and that there is experts out there, and we can sometimes connect them to experts that can do the work if, for example, curators who write the application themselves don't have the experience in provenance research. So they can bring in other people, scholars that can work on these collections. And I think a lot of that takes place in conversations at conferences, at workshops, in telephone conversation. It's a kind of really every minute work of persuading colleagues that there's a need for that research. And it's also, and I think that this last sentence that I should add maybe, to also make museum practitioners aware that the stories that we dig up through provenance research, it's stories about colonial history, but it's also stories about our entanglement with the world, with the rest of the world, so to say, entanglements, and that is, some of them are very violent, but it's still entanglements that have a lasting effect on our contemporary times, and that makes it interesting. And we've experienced that even museum visitors are very interested in these stories, in these histories about global entanglement. So it's ugly stories in a way, but it's also stories that make people understand how entangled we actually are, or have been for 500 years on this globe.
Thank you, Larissa. Lindley, I want to toss this same question to you because you work in a very different context with very different materials. And could you reflect on what it looks like in your institution and with your set of questions?
Yeah, my thoughts are more to do with how to make the case for the research within a specific institution. So I'll start by saying that I wasn't the person who got the initiative, the Provenance Initiative, off the ground at SAMA, because that happened before I came to San Antonio. And I also didn't directly advocate for my position to be extended, but I have a pretty good sense of what went on before and after I arrived. Even if I can't speak really to the nitty gritty of the funding situation. But I think there are sort of two phases where you can communicate the importance of provenance work to decision makers at your institution, whether that's the director or administrators, the board, or even maybe your direct supervisor, whoever it is in your particular case. So there's the phase before anyone has really been able to carry out extended provenance research and you need someone to do it. And then there's the phase when the research has started, but you need more time and more money to keep it going. So I can talk about both of those. Something I think that was very important about SAMA's situation is that our director was always very supportive of provenance research. So she never needed to be convinced of its importance, but I know that's not the case at every institution. Even in that situation, the curator of the Ancient Mediterranean collection, Jessica Powers, also paved the way for my work in a number of ways. So SAMA, at least until the pandemic, had visiting committees, which were made up of some board members and also other members of the community who were particularly interested in each collection. And so that was a context for a lot of the conversations that happened. The curator was, of course, able to research the history of some of the objects in the course of her ongoing work, individual objects, and then she could report interesting things that she found to people in the visiting committee and other people in the museum. But she also reported back when, for instance, she attended a workshop on antiquities provenance, or she could share cases that came up in the news of other museums who had made returns and talk about the circumstances of those returns, the response of the other museums. So that meant that a lot of people involved in San Antonio at the museum knew that our collection had similar objects to things that had been returned, and that the history of these objects wasn't very well known. So I think the key thing here is that the people involved were familiar with what provenance research was and why it was important before the museum even ever applied for the AAMD Crest Fellowship. You know that museum directors and boards don't like surprises. So whatever you can do to familiarize people with these issues when you're not in some kind of crisis situation is great. And you don't want people just sort of reacting to an emergency, but you also want them to know that it's reputationally beneficial for the museum to be proactive about doing this kind of work. So a lot of us, I think that everyone must be aware of provenance issues at this point, but especially if we were dealing with collections other than Nazi era European art, like the ones that we're talking about here, it can't hurt to introduce that information at as early a stage as possible, even if you don't know yet how you're going to be able to fund or organize provenance research. So that's probably something that a lot of people are already doing. But I could also talk about some things we did after my work began that I think helped it to continue. So for instance, I reported regularly to that visiting committee about my progress. And of course, I also gave updates to my supervisors and to the director, and they shared some of those discoveries with the board. I think that it's very helpful to share with people in these positions some of the methods and resources that you use when doing provenance research. Not only do they seem to actually find it interesting, I think it also makes clear why you need so much time and money for the work. So for instance, if you found something that was really important only after you flew halfway across the country or halfway across the world, and you spent several days combing carefully through an archive that's not digitized, that is useful information to share. But I think it's also great, if you can, to share positive results of your research. And by that, I don't just mean that you thought something could have been looted after 1970, but it turns out it wasn't. You know, you might have started the project out of a desire to identify problems in your collection and to fulfill your ethical responsibilities, and that's very important, of course. But provenance research, as many of us know, also just generally enlivens our understanding of our collection, similar to what Larissa said, whether that it's in a positive way or a disturbing way. So whether or not you have fun stories to tell may depend on the nature of your collection. But for instance, I found that we had some coins that had once belonged to the collection of the family of John Quincy Adams. We didn't know that before. And they were possibly in the president's collection itself, but you know, going back to the methods and research thing, I still need to do a little research to try to confirm whether or not the president owned them. There's a rather unassuming Greek vase in our collection that had belonged to the Courtauld family in London, and before that to a 19th century romantic poet named Samuel Rogers. This is information that we didn't have before. And of course, these people have their own stories, and it makes your understanding of your collection richer. So while yes, we're trying to understand uncomfortable histories, if you do have pleasant stories to tell alongside those, that's also one of the purposes of provenance research, is just to enrich our overall knowledge of the collection. So if you can, I would encourage sharing with stakeholders the good news as well as the bad news.
I just wanted to put a footnote on that. Lindley, thank you so much. I think you gave some really clear outlines about how you were able to both be the beneficiary of coming into a process that was already set up, but then also to maintain it and continue it, and how those lines of communication work. I particularly liked your framing of not to do this in a period of crisis or reactivity, but this is an idea that needs to be continually socialized. And I think that it resonates with how, during the period of time that I was at the Mellon Foundation, we were starting to investigate how American collections were approaching the display, the storage, the research surrounding Native, Indigenous collections and African collections, and just trying to understand their position relative to traditional European and American art forms as part of museum practice. And we didn't intentionally set about to start a provenance funding initiative, but we learned through our looking and consultation that this was a big piece of why these collections were in these disadvantaged and under-resourced positions, because those collections are just so profoundly poorly understood in the American context. And when the Savoy report came out, there was a we saw some attitudes that, oh, this doesn't apply to us because we're in America. We are not the colonizers. We didn't take this stuff, so we don't need to pay attention to this. And we were bumping up against this sort of attitudinal block that in the American context, the report was received very differently. And what would it take for American scholars, American curators to engage with this more directly? And with the help of our senior advisor, Dr. Janetta Cole, who used to be at the Smithsonian National Museum of African Art, we started to dig into these questions of how poorly understood and where these provenance gaps were. So as a funder, it was a process of education. None of us on the staff of Mellon at the time were particularly experts in these areas. We didn't come to this work out of deep knowledge of being researchers ourselves. We were generalists who were looking for ways to improve these practices and dialogues that led to the incorporation of provenance research as budget lines into grants that were more fully fledged, and looking at conservation of these collections, training of rising professionals entering heritage fields, where that training could be done in culturally competent ways. And so it was wrapped up in a lot of context around improving general stewardship practices, where provenance became a piece of engagement, responsible engagement. So Erica, did you want to talk about this case-making question, or did you want to pivot to some of the topics that we're seeing come in the chat?
I mean, there is something I can say very quickly about the case-making question, in that I would say our experience of going through the multiple rounds of applying for funding and getting feedback and seeing how we needed to change the way we were expressing ourselves was a really eye-opening experience, I think, because when we went into applying for the funding to do provenance research, we went in with this mentality of, we don't know what we don't know. And so we didn't want to presume about what we were going to find. And the feedback that we got from Mellon was pretty pointedly, you know, it just felt like it needed to be a stronger statement, that we needed to talk about repatriation more. We need to talk about these potential outcomes more in what we were discussing in our application. And I mean, it's because of course that's what we could find. And we just needed to be willing to embrace the possible outcomes more than saying, you know, there's just so many unknowns. It was sort of this embracing of the politics of the museum work itself that I think made our application much stronger than when we started. And so sort of, I think we needed to not be basically afraid of going out on a limb a little bit. And so that was something that I think really bettered our application. I mean, if you want me to, Allison, to address some of these questions that have been coming in, I can also turn to that.
I think there's a good window here to address the question of what collaborators do you have in country, or do you have collaborators at UCLA that are of African heritage or descent?
So, so part of this project is we have two advisory councils basically that we are working with over the course of this. We have one that is a smaller, it's predominantly academic advisory council, and one that is broader, that is meant to encompass many stakeholders in museum collections of African arts. And so we have you know, members, we have people who are of African descent on that. We have scholars, we have collectors, we have dealers, we have you know, people who are going to be looking at it from a whole range of perspectives, to get everyone in the same room. I will say we were going to have our first advisory council meeting with this larger group the week that everyone went home to work from home because of COVID. So we haven't had an in-person meeting. So now we are scheduling this as a Zoom meeting, unfortunately. But yes, we are working with a whole range of people to get a range of perspectives. Another part of the project was, in theory, given current pandemic you know, situations, we were intending to actually go and do research in Africa. We hadn't determined what part of the collection we were going to focus on yet that would lead to that research, so we didn't necessarily know where we would be going. but that was another way that we were going to hopefully engage with stakeholders in Africa to further these discussions. So I think we'll try to figure out how to do that remotely now, or potentially there will be a vaccine and we'll just go to Africa and it'll be perfect. We'll whichever nation or whichever cultural group we end up focusing on, wherever this collection sort of takes us.
And just as the counterpoint to that, I think being on the other side of that melon process, we were asking questions about why do you not have African collaborators? And we wanted to see more of that exchange built into the grant from the proposal stage. And I think UCLA very wisely pushed back and said, we don't know what we don't know. As Erica just said, we don't even know what communities we would be engaging with. We haven't even done the most basic level of research to even know who to reach out to yet. We need to do a lot of our own homework, our own self-examination, and we need to mine existing archives before we figure out how to even engage and under what terms. So there would be sort of it would be premature to assume that you could just get on the plane and go over and talk to who. You don't know what that is yet. And so we had to accept that there was sort of a sequencing to bringing in collaborators from the start before the institution had done its own work and built its own set of information and competencies. And I think that's weighing that up is part of the process, and also formulating the case that these things have to happen a little bit more sequentially.
Yeah, it felt funny to put in this grant, we need to go to the UK twice before we can do anything else, because we really needed to look at the one archive that has all of the auction catalogs that are not digitized. And so, this resulted in me taking a trip where in 6 days I looked at 220 auction catalogs, and I've only just put a dent into how many auction catalogs we need to look at. But just from that preliminary research, we have learned so much about this collection that really is helping us sort of drive what the next steps are. It's really been an invaluable resource for our furthering the provenance research.
On the program officer end, I had to go into my boardroom and advocate for this grant that had budget lines to send researchers to the UK to do African provenance research. And I needed to be prepared to defend that as well. It wasn't a given. And so we were working in tandem to make that case as strong as possible. But again, just like as though I was the researcher, I was in a position of needing to advocate up to even get the grant approved by our trustees. So there's a learning and dialogue process that went on that I think that's one of the reasons Erica and I are here today, to sort of talk about this sort of two ends of the funder-funded relationship and the complexities that were involved in that process. But I think we're going to move on to some of the other topics that are emerging. And I think the information piece is one that we're seeing come up in the chat, and it's one that we had anticipated wanting to talk about in advance, which is how can sharing this information, even if it is not perfect or complete, be beneficial? And I think there's a variant on that question in the chat about, or in the Q&A, sorry, about how this information is being documented in, to Erica specifically, but to all of you, how you document your information in collection management systems, who has permissions and access to see that information, even if it's not in completed states yet. And this second layer question about reluctance to provide much information even to other curators out of concern that such information is too sensitive to be shared. How can we share information to further provenance research on works in our own collections in a way that honors privacy concerns? So this is again another sort of multi-layered question about the complexities of incomplete information, sharing information. And then I'm curious, Larissa, sort of how information gets funneled back to you as in your funding, sort of how much you're privy to seeing once your funded work is complete, what gets sent back. So we can round robin on that. Lindley, do you want to start?
There I am, unmuted. Sure, yeah. Well, I actually haven't run into too many difficulties communicating with curatorial colleagues at other institutions and having them reluctant to share information. I know that there are probably some things that are just considered confidential that I don't know about, but I've had a lot of luck reaching out by email or, when I can travel, speaking to colleagues in person. So I can't talk too much about that. And I'm also, I know that we here in San Antonio are responsive to questions like that. As for sharing information in other ways, the AAMD and CREST Fellowship had a stipulation that the results of that year would be published. And what the museum decided was that they would publish those through online collection database, online collection records. And we didn't have those when I first started. And that, of course, is another, in addition to Provenance, is another big project that costs a lot of money and a lot of time to move things from an internal database to a web-based system. And you need people to edit information to make sure it makes sense to the public, to vet information and format it and to photograph things. So we're at the beginning of a long project working to get our collections online. But an important part of that, I'm not involved in most of that, but I do have the responsibility to update the provenance part of the database so that that can go online, and we push that out with the records. And so again, I think, as I mentioned, well, maybe I didn't mention it, but I think if you're looking for names in your research and you can just Google and find them in the records of other museums, that helps you to know who to contact. And so if we can put that information out there, there's as good a chance that whatever we have will be useful to someone else as what they have will be useful to us. And so, yeah, I think sharing, even if you don't have time to like go deep into the provenance outside of your internal records, if you can put the names and the dates that you have somewhere that's accessible, publish them in some way, that's actually one of the most important and helpful things, as we saw in the first session of this webinar, that having things out there, people may contact you with information.
Larissa, do you want to take it? You're muted.
We use a form, and that form is online at our website for applications. And there's 3 categories that are, I think, quite interesting in the context of funding. Transparency, sustainability, and collaboration with individuals, experts, scholars, institutions, interest groups from the countries of origin. And the latter is clearly what we talked about in the last round, is on collaborators. How do you bring in experts from the countries from which these objects stem from? So that's, in general, a very important focus of our funding line. But then the other 2 categories, transparency and sustainability, are very important. And we encourage institutions to, for example, around this project of provenance research that they get funded through us, that they do a kind of that they do significant work for raising awareness, for putting information online, disseminating the information that they have produced in the course of their research. And then also, and that's the point, sustainability, feed that information into all of their databases and make sure that the information is kept and is used and processed, in all areas and phases of museum work in the future. So I think this is what we stress by having these categories in our application forms. And then when these projects are carried out, we ask for reports. And I think the most important or the most productive effect is that in the end, from the final report, the findings are kind of extracted and then fed into a database that is run by the center, by the German Lost Art Foundation itself. And that database is called Provenance. And I'll add that link to to our repository. And Provenance at the moment is a database that assembles all the information of all the reports of projects that have been funded by our foundation in the last 5 years. And that's Nazi era provenance research. And we'll soon, once our projects have produced substantial data, we'll then also add these data to that database. And it's a quite complex database that can be used by the broader public, but you can also access, you can register specifically as a kind of professional in the field, and then you get an enhanced kind of access where you can download those reports that projects have produced, for example. There's other smaller modules and databases related to the German Lost Art Foundation and its projects, but Provenance is the big database that was launched earlier this year, I think end of January, early February. And this is how the foundation tries to create a tool that really makes data available for whoever is interested and keeps them for broader use.
Thank you, Larissa. Erica, did you want to weigh in on this question?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, so for us, you know, a lot of these questions are about how we track this. We don't use TMS. We use Argus as our database, and I know databases are always changing. We only recently updated Argus to web-based platform. So really, we've been working with a very, very old database for a very long time. So for us, a big part of this project was actually, I mean, it's incredible drudgery, but getting a whole lot of data into the database. And that's been a really important part of this provenance research for us, that we are trying to, I mean, we in the end, we came up with our approach was we created a spreadsheet of all of the data that we needed to upload into our database, which totaled, I mean, I think in the end we were over 5,000 rows of data, columns extending out over 20 columns. And we had our IT person write a program to upload all of this, which of course now we're checking virtually every single one of these. But this was, you know, this is months and months of data input that in the end, we finally now, when we go to a record, we have just the basic information of potentially the auction house that the objects were purchased at, you know, the potential previous owners before it went into Wellcome's collection. It feels small, but it's a huge change for us. And these types of crumbs basically are what allow you to take the next steps. We've also gotten very good at putting in cataloging notes. So when it comes to documenting the steps that we're taking in doing this provenance research, we'll input the data that we know, and then we will also input sort of what we're thinking or what the process was in these cataloging notes so that future generations have access to that all in the same place, all in that one record. So that's how we've been approaching that data. And there was one question from Adam Harris, the name of the UK archive. We've actually been going to the Wellcome archive. So this is sort of specific to us, that for our research, the Wellcome collection has an archive of everything that Wellcome collected in terms of paper. And when Wellcome was collecting, they also collected all of the auction catalogs. So they are a great resource if you're looking for auction catalogs from the first quarter of the 20th century because they have auction catalogs like Stevens Auction House, which, you know, was bombed in the war, and I can't find those resources elsewhere. And they seem to have a fair number of those. So if they could be a good resource for some early auction catalogs. They're not digitized, but Wellcome is the library is working on digitizing them as well.
So I think I'm seeing a couple of questions that pivot us back to this funding thread, which is one of the thrusts that we can offer as part of this series, is we have two active or former funders. So how do we advise giving ideas to museum? I'm sorry, I'm not doing a good job of interpreting here. So we have two questions. Ideas about how museum administrations can leverage existing funds to support provenance research, so we're not dependent on external funders. And then a very similar question, ways to build sustainable support, i.e. institutional budget lines for provenance research, or ways to argue for internal support. So I don't think we've really touched on that, but I'll pivot it right back to you, Erica. Being on a grant-funded project, what are you learning through this process that you could then be transferable to work you do in the future that gets baked into any other kind of work you do going forward?
You know, we're still incredibly exhibition focused at the Fowler. We have 4 spaces that we're constantly programming. You know, our shows, we've been trying to extend runs, but typically our exhibitions run 4 months, 4 to 5 months. So I think that, you know, going forward, especially given the financial situation that the United States is in right now, we will be looking at doing more collection-based shows potentially. And that's an opportunity to write into our budgets lines for provenance research on the collection as we organize these exhibitions. You know, I think once you've done some provenance research, and as Lindley said, it's telling these stories. Once you're able to tell the stories of provenance research and what you find, it becomes a very easy sell in a certain way, because the stories, be they, as I said, you know, exciting or disturbing, they are, you know, at the baseline, they're compelling, and the process is compelling. It really is something that I think when talking to funders, you can't help but see the value in it. And so in being able to bring that into exhibitions in the future in a more pointed way is something that we can always make a case for, because these do enrich our understandings of the objects in ways that just doing research from an academic perspective simply does not. So it's really, I think that this is something that we as an institution will look at as an important, valuable aspect of curation going forward.
Lindley, do you have a perspective on considering one object at a time versus working on entire collections at once? Or exhibition, you know, the ways in which it gets conceptually chunked up into funded work.
Well, I think that, I mean, I've sort of dove into entire collections at a time, but I think that, as I briefly said before, one of the things that helped to make the case for starting a major provenance research project was that our curator had researched the history of certain objects and had interesting stories to tell about them, and had, you know, found that they had longer histories than we ever knew about. And so that had to be done as part of a bigger research project, as Erica suggested. But whenever you can do that, I think whenever you can take a little extra time to do that and then share that whatever you find, I think it does help to show the importance and the depth that you can get from provenance research.
I mean, I'd like to emphasize the ethical dimension of provenance research, and that's something that I think comes through very clearly through this comment where someone says, at this time when anti-Black racism is drawing global attention, I'd be interested to hear from the panel, especially those who work in colonial era provenance, what they see as the value and role of provenance research for racial justice and healing. And I think this is a very important point. And this is why in the Savoir report, the authors speak of a new relational ethics. And after all, this is the motivation that has been driving me as someone who's been looking at the history of colonialism and the memory of colonialism in Namibia for so many years. I think we have to really reflect upon our institutions and understand the epistemologies behind them. We have to understand how these institutions have come into being and how they have worked. And we have to question the ethics, the historical ethics, or the mode on which they operated historically. And fortunately, there's in the past couple of years or even decades in the meantime, post-colonial theory, post-colonial studies, indigenous studies. I mean, all those fields have contributed immensely to critical scholarly work that has shown how these collections can help us understand our own history with its violent aspects and can help us recognize our counterparts and the people from which objects have been collected or taken, sometimes even traded or have been gifted. So, I mean, there's this whole spectrum, from totally violent to non-violent, this whole spectrum of acquisitions. But I think provenance research is not only a way of knowing more about our institutions and understanding them better, but it's also about these new relational ethics and how do we actually build bodies of knowledge, but not in a conventional way, but together with people who know better than us, for example, what these objects stand for, what their meaning has been, what they can be used for in the contemporary era. So I think these building relationships via these objects and via the provenance research, that's for me, I think, one of the most crucial points in provenance research. And I think it very much also applies to provenance research on the National Socialist era, because after all, it's about redress for dispossession, for persecution, and for genocide. Even though, returning and restituting artworks can never repair that.
Yes, and I'll just add that, as someone pointed out in the Q&A, that the Nazi era provenance is not a distinct thing from antiquities provenance, because of course antiquities were also looted and seized during the Nazi era, and so it's difficult
the colonial era.
them, but yeah, it's something that we need to use all of those resources together.
Yeah, I mean, I think especially anyone working with African arts from the colonial period, it's inescapable, this concept of relational ethics at this point, because as Larissa is saying, there is this spectrum that you find also that is, I think something that in the conversations that happen in the press, everything gets a little compressed and you get to see the true complexity of what you're dealing with, that in what we're finding, it is everything ranging from looted objects all the way to an incredible number of objects that were clearly made for the international market, and that there is this vibrant African artist, tradition of selling to Europeans, and that there is this engagement and looking at this holistically and going and being the next step being talking to people about how these objects best serve everyone in the future, that this is not about how they best serve the Fowler Museum, that this is world heritage. We are a world art museum, global arts museum. This is not about us. It is about thinking about how we engage with people on the continent to share not just objects, also knowledge, and have that kind of exchange of knowledge that is so incredibly important.
I could add maybe that on the level of methodology in the colonial era or post-colonial provenance research, as we've come to call it here, that requires, I mean, these new relational ethics also requires a different approach to research sometimes, because what we try to do is that to develop research agendas together with partners overseas. And that actually, the effect of that is that, I mean, in this Anglophone academic scholarly world, we pretty much know, you know, what our main questions are, what the theories are that we draw on, what the methodologies are. But for example, in indigenous societies, we've got different ontologies of what an object is and whether an object embodies a person, embodies an ancestor. I mean, totally different ways of knowing the world, and thus also of knowing objects come in. And we have to embrace these ways, and we have to learn to understand them. And out of that, do provenance, a kind of different provenance research that can accommodate the classical scholarly provenance research, but also oral history, different ontologies, and by that also accommodate the questions that our counterparts have, you know, because our questions are museum questions and history questions. Their questions may be spiritual questions, contemporary questions, questions of empowerment, or as this person from the audience said, social justice, for example. And to incorporate these questions into our agendas and negotiate agendas for research on the objects jointly, I think that's the big challenge, but that's also the big opportunity, because that will really make us learn more, you know, and go beyond our conventional horizons in museum work.
Larissa, I want to thank you for picking up that question. I was mentally saving it for last because I knew it was going to be big and take a lot of space and require a lot of time. And so I'm glad that it was actually helpful, I think, to put it in a little bit earlier in the order of things. I would just reflect on a slightly different approach to the same body of responses that you all have very generously built. And I think looking at the discourse of American museums right now, even in the last 3 to 4 weeks, how radically things are shifting and how much reckoning has to be done. I think the opportunity to foreground the value of provenance into these conversations may create new opportunities for some of these funding questions, for some of these questions of prioritization of research resources for money and time, that if these organizations that are professing very publicly in their statements that they're aiming to commit to action and to change and to whatever their format of decolonization is, if they're starting to talk in those words. And we've seen a wide variety of responses and level of sincerity of commitment. But there could be opportunities for the curators in this audience to push on provenance that we need to enter these debates. We need to engage much more directly. And in order to do that, we need to know what we have in our house. And we need to do the work ourselves, and we need to turn inward to these collections. Because if we are the stewards of this material that doesn't rightfully belong to us or has stories that we haven't respectfully engaged with, then we are not fulfilling our obligation as cultural institutions, particularly in this moment when this is what's being asked of us in the cultural heritage dialogues. So I think it's one strategy among many. And I hate to put it so cynically because I don't mean it in that spirit. But I do think there's a moment here where those who are engaged with the storytelling and the history making and the ontologies of knowledge, as Larissa, you gave that really helpful framing, have armature to be heard in a new way as directors are opening up senior administrators to what kinds of actions and where should their organization be positioning themselves in these debates.
Allison, I would say this is why we're trying to use social media to actually disseminate some of our provenance research. That, you know, it's all well and good for us to give papers on this to other scholars at conferences that no one else outside of, you know, our sort of little bubble is going to see. But we do, you know, we came up with this, you know, the hashtag Welcome Wednesdays, and every Wednesday we are posting objects or stories about the people who collected them, or, you know, any number of things, the conservation history. You know, we have we'll have posts on finding beads that have uranium in them from the collection. And the next week we'll post something about, a very controversial figure who maybe collected something in the Congo and it has ended up in our collection. And so this is entirely incomplete research. We are putting it out there just to, hope that as many people see it as possible, and we'll get feedback. And, it's sort of this, this attempt to just reach as many people, to get as many people engaged as we can. And, it's, we have seen, like the social media, you got to see those numbers tick up, right? And so we have seen an increasing number of people sort of viewing these posts, and hopefully we'll start to get more engagement through that, as a way of sort of taking these conversations broader.
I think that that gets at the question that we have here about communicating the complexity. As you said, the press tends to flatten the nuance. And so I hope that addresses the questioner's inquiry here. I like very much this question. I think it's a good pivot from this thread to how we manage expectations, especially in cases where researchers have been hired for a fixed term. What do you do if you fall short of a proposed target, because provenance research always takes more time? And how do you frame that request? Lindley, I think you started to get at that earlier on. And as a fixed term researcher, I think you're probably the best position to take that question on.
Sure. I mean, fortunately, because it was sort of the first time doing this kind of work at San Antonio, and I had to learn how to do the research as part of my year of conducting the research. The expectations, I wouldn't say that the expectations were low, but we didn't know how much progress could be made during the year. But I think just being very clear with anyone who might be in the position to decide whether you continue or not, being clear about your process, and being clear about the need for certain resources, and you might spend 2 weeks looking at 70 publications and not finding something, that's a normal part of the research. But yeah, it's people always want to ask me, how many objects have you finished? And that generates a long answer about how I'll look at something and then I'll leave it for a few months and I'll come back and discover that the new resources have appeared, or I can understand some kind of notation that relates to the object now that I've looked at other objects that I didn't understand the first time. And so I don't know if that's a very clear strategy, but just to be, because a lot of people in your institution are not going to be familiar with the sort of nitty-gritty details of provenance research, to sort of take them along with you in the process when you can might help.
So we are bumping up against our time limit. I think as a way of wrapping up, I think there's one last question I'd like to put to our panelists for a very, very brief answer, if you have any last thoughts. And it's an attempt to synthesize a theme that's running throughout some of the questions that we weren't able to get to. And that is really, where do we apply for funding? How do we get more money for these kinds of research questions for other types of collections, Asian art materials in the United States, for example? And what are the networks that can be formed and supported that help elevate the visibility and the necessity of provenance research so that it gets more attention from funders and resource allocators? Any last thoughts before we close?
Well, I can just offer, I mean, I don't have an overview of the US situation, obviously, but I can offer for the German landscape of funders. We're currently doing an overview of who is active in that field and which funding lines can accommodate provenance research. So if anyone is out there and interested or needs advice on that, We're actually there to give advice. That's one of the tasks that we have at the German Lost Art Foundation. So just get in contact with us. And as long as it concerns a collection that is held in a German institution, we can give hints and information as to whether you can apply with a German partner at our foundation or whether there's other funding lines that offer themselves for a project application.
Thank you, Larissa. That's great. Any thoughts about networking and building support among colleagues?
I mean, I think that we all just need to not be afraid to reach out to our colleagues whenever we have any of these questions. I know, you know, the world of Africanist art historians is small. We are a pretty small field, and we only, we get together every 3 years, and every 3 years I'm like, oh yeah, I know all you people now. So it's sort of this, after a few years in the field, you have a built-in resource. It's just about maintaining those networks. I would say WhatsApp is a great tool. We have, like I'm on a bunch of Africanist WhatsApp groups where it's just people are always asking questions about provenance or museum labels or resources. And so I think it's just that this is the legwork that we all have to do, and it just there aren't necessarily overarching frameworks for it. We have to build them ourselves, and that takes time, and it's tough, but it definitely pays dividends once you get it going.
Well, and our thanks to AAMC for providing this platform that reaches researchers, curators, scholars across so many subdisciplines and geographies that can be networked through these events and hopefully inspired to find one another, with AAMC as the glue in the middle of providing these resources and these opportunities for conversation. We do need to wrap up. I apologize to those who asked questions that we were not able to get to. Thank you all so much for being part of today's conversation. A recording will be shared within the next week, and we look forward to seeing you all at the final session Wednesday, June 24th. Be well, everybody. Take care. Thank you.